a lot of energy.
So where does the energy come from? A single muscle fiber, so one muscle cell, okay, can have up to 15 billion thick filaments. Each thick filament having 300 heads, right? 300 heads? Right?
I've got a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So now, if like say like somebody's like bodybuilding and everything, and then they quit
Yeah.
and they lose muscle, what happens when you lose muscle?
Those protein fibers, if they're not, you know, you've heard this phrase, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Right.
That those,
Disintegrate?
they basically break down, yeah, because if they're not needed, they're basically recycled into amino acids.
So when you build muscle up, the thick filament gets bigger and you get
Well, you get more of them.
more
You
of
make
them.
more of them.
Okay, but if you don't use them, they just actually go away.
Exactly.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah. Yeah, because you don't make more muscle cells. Each muscle cell can get bigger because it'll get bigger because you're making more filaments.
Okay, can you get more muscle fibers?
No, because a muscle fiber is a muscle cell.
Right. Okay, so it's the microfiber.
You can get more myofibrils
Biofiber. That's what
inside
it
a
is.
muscle cell.
Okay, that's what it
Exactly.
was, okay.
Yeah. I know, it's like, grrr.
Yeah.
So, a single muscle cell, muscle fiber, can use 2,500 molecules of ATP per second. So, once your deep contraction started, you better have a way to generate more ATP, or you're not going to get, that contraction is not going to last very long. All right, so right now, your muscles are pretty much just hanging out, resting. When muscles rest, of course, your cardiovascular system is pumping plenty of blood to the muscles, plenty of oxygen is getting there. They're not using a lot of energy. In fact, when a muscle cell is at rest, what it wants to do is store energy, so they will have it when it does need it. So any glucose that is delivered by the blood to the muscle cell, sorry, I'm blank there. Ooh. Wait, is it 8:30? Oh no, I'm good. Gets converted to glycogen. Remember, that is glycogenesis. I know your favorite words. I love these words, and everybody always hates them. So, when you take glucose and you put molecules of glucose together into a great big molecule of glycogen, that's called glycogenesis. Glyco. Golly, I am brain dead today. Glycogen is this. Woo. Okay. As a muscle cell is resting, it does need some ATP. And so what it uses for ATP are the fatty acids. So they say if you've got good muscle tone, okay, muscle tone, remember, is there's a few muscle cells contracting a little bit that kind of keeps the muscle toned up, and so it's using energy. And so when a muscle's at rest, a little bit of energy is being used. Mainly, that's fatty acids. So when you do muscle building exercises, you actually speed up your metabolic rate, and you're actually burning fat. You're burning the fatty acids from the bloodstream. Does that make sense? All right, and then of course, the fatty acids, remember beta oxidation, broken down 2 carbons at a time into a No. I remember. Acetyl-CoA gets converted, or enters the Krebs cycle, and you get a bunch of
ATP.
well, not yet.
You get hydrogen.
Well, then I get something that carries a something.
Oh.
Huh? Electron transporters. What were those called? One started with the N, one started with the F.
Oh, that's the FADH.
FADH2 and NADH, and they carried the electrons over to the.
What aren't they coenzymes?
They are coenzymes as well.
That's what I
Yes.
thought.
Yeah, they're electron transport molecules and coenzymes. That's correct. Yeah. And then the electrons bounce out. Then the protons get pumped. The protons run back in. You get a bunch of. There you go. Oh crap! See, I told you we come back. Okay. Now, the ATP that's generated here, a little bit of it's used just to keep the cell alive, but a lot of it is used to convert something called creatine to creatine phosphate. Now, what is creatine? That's what they tell you at the health food store. Now remember, ATP is the adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so essentially what you do is once you get ATP from breakdown of fatty acids, one of the phosphates from the ATP gets transferred to this protein called creatine. And so you go from 3 phosphates here and none here to 1 phosphate here and 2 there. And so creatine phosphate is a temporary storage form of energy. Does that make sense? Creatine phosphate is more stable than ATP. ATP is not very stable. It'll break down by itself. It'll break down into ADP and phosphate by itself. And then, of course, when you're taking glucose and putting a bunch of glucose molecules together to make glycogen, that you're adding energy. You're making covalent bonds. So you have to put energy into that. So you need ATP for that as well. So basically, when a muscle cell is resting, its overall job is to store up energy. It's going to need a lot of it when it has to contract. So it wants to take as much energy in or as much nutrients as it can, glucose and fatty acids. Take the glucose, store it as glycogen. Take the fatty acids, make ATP. From the ATP, get energy to make the glycogen. And then convert some of that ATP to creatine phosphate. Now, and Emily, I'm glad you said what you did. You can go to the health food stores and buy creatine. It's a protein. Proteins are made out of, when you take a tablet of creatine or drink it in a smoothie, my husband's a big smoothie drinker, you just break it down into the amino acids. The amino acids go into the amino acid pool. The creatine doesn't go from the tablet to your stomach and your muscles. Yeah, but it doesn't. But that's what they make you think it does. Okay? Now, moderate activity. Me walking around up here. Now, I'm not stressing the muscles out. I'm not maxing out my cardiovascular system. So the blood is still delivering plenty of oxygen to the muscle cells. But the muscle cells now are going to start to use some of that energy that they've stored. The glycogen gets broken down to glucose, and that's glycogenolysis. The glucose, of course, gets converted to pyruvate. Pyruvate gets converted to a little 2-carbon fragment that goes into the Krebs cycle. What were we just talking about? Acetyl-CoA. Okay. Acetyl-CoA, there's a Krebs cycle, yada, 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 right? Okay. Now, notice that we haven't touched the creatine phosphate. Moderate levels of activity, not maximum activity, but just moderate levels of activity. The energy is basically that the muscle cell is using is generated from the glycogen being converted to glucose, and the glucose basically converted to pyruvate, and then pyruvate goes through the whole Krebs cycle, electron transport, all that business. Make sense? Okay. Now, maximum activity, peak activity. Your cardiovascular system is working as hard as it can, but the muscle cells want more oxygen than they can get. The cardiovascular system can only deliver so much oxygen. So here, what happens is your muscle cells switch to anaerobic metabolism. Moderate activity, they're in aerobic metabolism. Maximum activity, they're in anaerobic metabolism. You're on one of those machines at the gym, and most of them now have heart rate monitor things. You can hold on to the handles, or if you've got one on your wrist, it'll like talk to it by radio. It's kind of cool. Except for once I start sweating, then it gets off. But it's measuring my movement, I believe. And so usually there's a little chart that says, okay, your heart rate should be between here and here for aerobic activity. If it's over here, it's too high. If it's over here, it's not high enough. So that range, that's when you're in this moderate activity. If your heart rate's too high, you're pushing yourself to the anaerobic metabolism. Does that make sense? Now here, of course, what happens is most of the energy is produced by glycolysis. Remember that glycolysis, when you take glucose and convert it to 2 pyruvates, That's glycolysis. Right? Remember, that's anaerobic. You don't need oxygen for that. If you go any further, pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, acetyl-CoA to Krebs cycle, yada, 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 that's where you need oxygen. Cool? All right. Now, what happens, though, is once you get the glucose converted to pyruvate, the pyruvate can't enter, without enough oxygen, it can't enter the mitochondria. It's not going to get converted to acetyl-CoA. So the pyruvate gets converted to lactate, or lactic acid. And so we talked about lactic acid buildup makes your muscles sore. Well, they don't know if it's the lactic acid itself, or what happens is when lactic acid builds up, the pH begins to drop, and then some of the myofilaments, some of those proteins begin to break down. So if you're trying to build muscle strength, and not just aerobic endurance, not just cardiovascular fitness, then yes, you need to stress the muscles to their maximum. No pain, no gain. The muscle cells cannot use lactate. Lactate has to diffuse out of the muscle cells into the bloodstream and go to the liver. The liver has the enzymes to convert the lactate back to pyruvate and even back to glucose if necessary. And then the glucose can go back. It's called the Cori cycle. We'll get to that here. What is when a muscle cell is resting, what does it use for its ATP generation? Oxygen. Well, no, it has to have oxygen, but what's it breaking down? No, not at rest. Oxygen. Fatty acids.
Yay.
So number 1 is fatty acids. Number 2 is oxygen. Because number 1 and number 2 are going into the yay bucket. Okay. All right. Now, what happens is when fatty acids go in and oxygen goes in, they get broken down with beta oxidation, yada yada yada. And then ADP, number 3, gets converted to ATP. All right, now, number 5 is, no, glucose. Remember, glucoses are always hexagonal. Glucose goes into the muscle cell, and at rest, when the muscle cell is resting, glucose is converted to glycogen. Woohoo! And so what this is showing you is some of that ATP that was made over here from the fatty acid breakdown is used up to do that. You need some energy to put those glucose molecules together into that big polysaccharide, big glycogen. All right, now some of that ATP, however, is combined with number 7, which is creatine. To make number 8, which is creatine phosphate. All right, now, anybody know what number 9 is? Huh? Well, no, that's the mitochondria. What's going out of it? CO2, carbon dioxide. Woo! Because you take in oxygen and you produce CO2. Okay, now, moderate activity. Number 1 is glycogen, and that gets converted to glucose. Glucose gets converted to pyruvate. Woo! Going from 1 to 2, from glycogen to glucose, that's called what? Nope. Glycogen. Glycolysis. Right? Yeah. Okay. Going from glucose to pyruvate is glycolysis. Okay. Now remember, you do get a little bit of ATP from that, right? You net 2 ATPs for every glucose that you break down. Okay. So 4 is ADP, 5 is ATP. 6 is oxygen. 7 is fatty acids. Okay. So the muscle cell can still use that if they're there. And so the pyruvate, the fatty acids, the oxygen, all that goes in the mitochondria, and we get lots and lots of ATP. So A would be ADP again. And 9 to be AT. And of course, moderate activity, all of this ATP, whether it comes from the anaerobic process here or the aerobic processes that are going on here, it's used for muscle contraction because the muscle cell is active. It's being stimulated. And the whole contraction cycle going on. And of course, again, 10 is CO2. Because all the carbons in the glycogen, which is broken down to glucose, which is broken down to pyruvate, and all the carbons in the fatty acids, all of those carbons have to be gotten rid of as CO2. We've extracted the energy out of those molecules. We've ripped the electrons off. And we've used it to make ATP. And then the ATP has been used up to make, to allow muscle contraction. Okay, peak activity, maximum muscle activity. Number one again is glycogen gets converted to glucose. Glucose gets converted to pyruvate. Pyruvate converts, going from glucose to pyruvate converts a little bit of ADP to ATP. Now, 6 is creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate gets the phosphate broken off of it, and it's converted to creatine. Here's a 7. And when that happens, that phosphate that was on here is used to convert ADP back to ATP. So this process, when the muscle cell is under maximum peak activity, this process can go backwards to generate more ATP. Again, the ATP, whether it's coming from and all of this, by the way, is an anaerobic process. Whether it's coming from glycolysis or conversion of creatine phosphate, the muscle cell can contract. Now the problem is we've got this. What's number 3? Pyruvate. Without enough oxygen present, pyruvate cannot enter the mitochondria. So pyruvate gets converted to lactate or lactic acid. Either one is fine. Lactic acid is with a hydrogen, lactate without. But either term is fine. Lactate is just easier to say. It's like pyruvic acid and pyruvate are the same, right? And then that has to go into the bloodstream. The muscle cells cannot use lactate. Now, here's the problem with peak activity, with anaerobic metabolism. First thing that happens, of course, is lactic acid begins to build up. And that can damage the muscle cell. But also, you are sucking up glucose like crazy. You're only getting 2 ATP per molecule of glucose. So it's not a very efficient use. If you're doing moderate activity, you can get 36 to 38 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose, right? You go from glucose to pyruvate, pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, yada, yada, yada. If you can only do the first step, if you only do the glycolysis part, you only net 2 ATP. So you're going to use whatever glycogen stores you have, you're going to use them very quickly. That's why when athletes do sprints or dashes, they're pushing their muscles immediately to their maximum. And that's why they can't sprint very far. You see them collapse at the end. All right, so everybody's experienced muscle fatigue. You're at the gym and you're lifting weights, and you can only lift them so many times. I mean, there's just, no matter what your brain says, at some point your muscles say, screw you, right? Well, they quit. So what happens is, the reason that you have muscle fatigue, part of it is psychological. Oh, I can't do this anymore. You know, they say runners, you hit the wall. If you can get through the wall, you can run for another, 2 or 3 miles or something. Anyway, so there is a psychological thing, but there's also a physiological stuff that's happening. You've used up all your glycogen stores. You've used up all your creatine phosphate. There's nothing to make any more ATP. If you're pushing to the max and you're producing lactic acid, the membranes start to get damaged. The sarcolemma and the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When pH drops, that messes up with calcium's ability to bind to the troponin. So if calcium's not on the troponin, what's covering the active sites? Tropomyosin. And so it doesn't matter how much energy you would have, if you had any, myosin heads can't grab anyway. So that's muscle fatigue. Now, what happens is, even when you're, when you do in your gym and you're doing sets, you're doing reps, you do, 3 sets of, 6 to 15 reps or something like that. How long do you wait between sets? 15 seconds, yeah, 30 seconds. And so you don't have to wait very long for you to get some recovery, for you to build back up some energy stores. Now, usually what happens is you could do 15 reps the first set, 12 reps the second set, 4 reps. Does that make sense? So, even just waiting 15 seconds, you do recover some, but you're not going to get full recovery. That's why they say you should do, upper body weights on Monday and lower body weights on Tuesday. You should alternate and give 24 hours between. So what's going on during that recovery period is any lactic acid that's built up diffuses into the bloodstream, gets into the liver, gets recycled. And then you repay what's called an oxygen debt. So we'll talk about each one of those. Okay. This cycle is called the Cori cycle. I think that's not yet there. It's the Cori cycle. And it's basically just for some reason, muscle cells don't make the enzymes necessary to utilize the lactate, but the liver does. So the liver can take the lactate, convert it back to pyruvate. It can actually take pyruvate and make glucose out of it. Or it can take the pyruvate, break it down to acetyl-CoA and make fatty acids. I mean, whatever. So that's the Cori cycle. And then the oxygen debt, what's going on here? You think, well, I can store oxygen. Actually, muscle cells can store a little bit of oxygen. Muscle cells have a protein called myoglobin. Myoglobin is a cousin to hemoglobin. And so this is a molecule that, or a protein that can actually hold on to an oxygen molecule. So the more myoglobin a muscle cell has, the more oxygen it can kind of temporarily store. But what we really mean by oxygen debt is basically getting back to that pre-exertion state, getting all of those energy stores back to normal. You need oxygen for the liver cells to recycle the lactate. You need muscle cells to restore the CP is creatine phosphate, to build glycogen back up. And of course your sweat glands are sweating because you've raised your body temperature, so you got to cool down. So basically this oxygen debt is to get you back to where you were before. And so your oxygen utilization is increased even after you stop exercising. Because you need oxygen to do all this. Does that make sense?